This is a brass button. It sits behind museum glass in Greenwich, London. The metal is corroded to a dull green patina, and if you could touch it, if the curator would allow such a thing, it would feel cold, unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that seeps into bone marrow and never leaves. This button once fastened the Royal Navy jacket of a man named Lieutenant John Irving. It was recovered from Arctic permafrost decades after Irving disappeared, found near skeletal remains that had been methodically dismembered. The question this button asks is simple. When you're starving to death in absolute darkness, surrounded by men you've known for years, do you wait for them to die first, or do you stop waiting? This is Captain Francis Crozier. He was the man who had to answer that question. Francis Rawdon Moira Crozier should have commanded the Franklin expedition. Everyone knew it. He had been to the Antarctic with James Clark Ross. He had survived 2 Arctic winters. He understood ice conditions better than any officer in the Royal Navy. At 49 years old, he possessed the perfect combination of experience and stamina. But the Admiralty passed him over for Sir John Franklin, a man 12 years older, soft around the middle, beloved by London society but untested in true Arctic conditions. The reason was unspoken but understood. Crozier was Irish. In 1845, that mattered. No matter his competence, no matter his record, he would always be second choice to an English gentleman. So Crozier accepted command of HMS Terror, the support vessel, the lesser ship, and prepared to follow Franklin into the ice. He did so without complaint, because that's what junior officers do. They swallow their pride and execute orders. But Crozier knew. Sitting in his cabin as Terror sailed down the Thames, reviewing charts by lamplight, he knew this expedition was flawed. Franklin had never commanded in pack ice. The route chosen was the most dangerous possible approach, and the supplies, those thousands upon thousands of tins, came from the lowest bidder, sealed with methods Crozier didn't trust. He wrote letters to his friend James Clark Ross, expressing quiet concerns. He never sent them. You don't question the Admiralty once ships have sailed. On deck, his crew worked with the efficiency of men who believed in British invincibility. The oldest was 44, many were teenagers. They signed on for adventure and advancement, for the prestige of polar exploration. They trusted that Crozier and Franklin would bring them home. That trust was the heaviest burden Crozier carried, heavier than his rank, heavier than his disappointment at being passed over. These men believed in him. He would fail them all. Papa! Terror and Erebus spent their first Arctic winter of 1845 to 1846, frozen into the ice near Beechey Island. This was expected, even planned. Winter quarters. The ships remained mobile enough that when spring came, they could break free and continue west. Crozier used the time to drill his crew, to maintain discipline, to keep minds occupied against the 4 months of darkness. But 3 men died that first winter. Able Seaman John Torrington in January, Royal Marine William Braine in April, able Seaman John Hartnell days later. They were buried on Beechey Island in graves blasted from permafrost, their coffins lowered while crew members sang hymns that the wind swallowed. Crozier stood at attention during the services, his face revealing nothing. But in his cabin afterward, he documented symptoms in his log: confusion, weakness, complaints of metallic taste. The deaths were attributed to pneumonia and tuberculosis, reasonable diagnoses in Arctic conditions. Crozier suspected something else. He didn't know what, just that wrongness that men who survive by trusting their instincts learn to recognize. He ordered the ship's surgeon to conduct autopsies. The findings were inconclusive. Men died in the Arctic. This was known. But these men were young and previously healthy. It nagged at Crozier like a splinter under skin. The ships broke free in summer 1846 and sailed south through Peel Sound. Franklin was jubilant. They'd found an open channel, exactly what the Admiralty wanted. Crozier remained cautious. The ice here was treacherous, prone to sudden movements. He signaled his concerns to Erebus. Franklin signaled back, "Proceed as ordered." By September, both ships were locked in pack ice off King William Island. They would never move again. Crozier stood on Terror's deck that first morning of immobility, watching the ice pressure ridge build around the hull. The temperature was already dropping toward winter. The sun sat lower on the horizon each day, and somewhere in his gut, that part of him that had kept him alive through 3 polar expeditions, he felt the trap close. Not just on the ships, on time itself. They had maybe 2 more chances at summer thaw, maybe 1. After that, the supplies would run out, and supplies were everything. Without them, they were just meat freezing slowly in the world's largest tomb. He didn't share these thoughts with his officers. Leaders don't traffic in despair. Instead, he ordered winter preparations, fuel rationing, watch rotations, educational lectures to occupy minds. He organized chess tournaments and theatrical productions. He made sure every man had duties, because idle hands and idle minds in Arctic darkness lead to madness faster than cold leads to death. But at night, alone in his cabin, Crozier wrote letters he knew no one would ever read. Letters to his sister, to James Clark Ross, to a woman he'd loved in Van Diemen's Land who'd rejected his marriage proposal years before. In those letters he admitted what he couldn't tell his crew, that he suspected they were dying already, that something was wrong with the supplies, that Franklin's optimism was killing them as surely as the ice. He dated each letter carefully. It was the only way to track time when day and night became meaningless. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th of June, 1847. The official record would state natural causes. The truth, Crozier suspected, was far more complex. He'd watched Franklin deteriorate over the preceding months. The confusion, the tremors, the sudden rages followed by periods of childlike placidity. Lead poisoning, though Crozier didn't have the medical knowledge to name it, he just knew that Franklin's mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere the cold and dark couldn't reach, but also couldn't save him from. They held the funeral service on the ice between ships. 24 men had died by then. The crew lined up in dress uniforms despite the cold breath crystallizing, faces gaunt. Crozier read the service in a voice that carried across the frozen silence. He spoke about duty, about sacrifice, about Franklin's dedication to England and Crown. He didn't mention that Franklin had spent his final days convinced he was dining with the Admiralty, setting phantom tables for phantom guests while scurvy loosened his teeth. Command fell to Crozier. It was what he'd been trained for, what he deserved, what he'd been denied. Now he had it, and it meant nothing. He was captain of 2 frozen ships filled with dying men, trapped in ice that showed no sign of breaking, responsible for an expedition that was already a failure. History would remember Franklin as the leader. Crozier would be the man who couldn't save them. He moved into Franklin's cabin aboard Erebus. It felt like inhabiting a ghost. Franklin's personal effects remained: books, letters from his wife, navigation instruments. Crozier left them untouched. Instead, he spent his nights reviewing supplies, calculating consumption rates, running mathematics that all ended the same way. They would run out of food before the ice released them. Even if they rationed severely, they had maybe one more year, 2 winters total. The lead was in everything now. Crozier could taste it, metallic, wrong, like sucking on copper coins. His hands tremored when he wrote. Some mornings he woke convinced he was back in Van Diemen's Land, could smell eucalyptus and hear kookaburras. Then reality would crash back. The cold, the darkness, the groaning of ice, crushing the hull millimeter by millimeter. His officers came to him with reports of increasing illness, men seeing things in the darkness outside, shapes moving across the ice that couldn't be there. Others suffering seizures. Several cases of what the surgeon called melancholia, but what Crozier recognized as the specific despair of men who understood they were watching their own deaths approach in slow motion. He made the decision no captain wants to make: prepare to abandon ship. Imagine being Francis Crozier in those final months aboard ship. You wake in darkness because there's no daylight, only the weak glow of oil lamps that you must ration because fuel is finite. Your mouth tastes like metal. Your gums bleed when you probe them with your tongue. The ship makes sounds around you, ice pressure creating groans and shrieks that sound almost human. Almost. You know that every decision you make now determines who lives longest, not who survives. Survival is no longer possible, but who gets a few more weeks of consciousness before the end? You calculate food rations, not in terms of nutrition, but in terms of delaying death. You watch men younger than your nephews waste away, their eyes asking questions you cannot answer honestly. And worst of all, you know this is your fault, not the ice, not Franklin's death, not the lead in the tins. Your fault. Because you're in command now, and in command, everything is your fault. Every death bears your name. Every failure of supply, every moment of suffering, every instance when you must look a dying man in the eyes and lie about rescue coming, it's yours. You own it. This is what destroys commanders. Not the physical hardship. Bodies can endure remarkable torment. It's the moral mathematics, the constant equation of who eats and who doesn't, who gets medicine and who must simply endure, who stays warm and who freezes. You make these choices, and then you live with them, except you don't live because you're dying too, just slowly enough to watch every consequence of every decision ripple outward into suffering. Crozier carried 105 men onto the ice when they abandoned ship. He knew most would die within weeks. He led them anyway because standing still meant certain death, and walking meant merely probable death, and human beings will always choose motion over stasis, even when motion is futile. That's not leadership. That's the cruelest arithmetic there is. On the 22nd of April, 1848, Crozier gave the order. Abandon ships. They would march south toward Back's Fish River, dragging sledges loaded with supplies and lifeboats. The distance, roughly 250 miles across ice, rock, and tundra that offered nothing but resistance. At their current state of health, covering 5 miles a day would be optimistic. The math was impossible. But impossible was better than sitting still. 105 men formed up on the ice that morning. Crozier stood at the front, his uniform pristine despite everything, his posture military straight. Behind him stretched a line of ghosts wearing Royal Navy blue. Their faces were skeletal, their eyes too large in shrunken sockets. Many could barely stand. Some wept silently. Others stared at nothing, with the expression of men who'd already died, but whose bodies hadn't received the message. The sledges were madness made manifest. 1,200 pounds per sledge loaded with items Crozier couldn't explain. Silk handkerchiefs, sterling silver dinnerware, Books, button polish. He'd tried to enforce rationality, keep only food, medicine, weapons, tools. But the lead poisoning had them now. Officers refused to leave behind their dress uniforms. Men insisted on dragging personal effects that would kill them through sheer weight. And Crozier, standing at the intersection of discipline and insanity, had to choose: enforce reason and watch men mutiny, or allow the madness and hope they'd abandon items as weakness overcame stubbornness. He chose to let them carry their civilization. It was all they had left. They marched south. The first day covered maybe 4 miles. Men collapsed into snow and had to be dragged onto sledges, adding weight that other dying men had to pull. The second day, 3 miles. The third day, 2. Crozier walked at the front, setting pace, stopping regularly to let the stragglers catch up. He knew this pattern. Bodies failing, distances shrinking, the mathematics of death accelerating. On the 5th day, Crozier found one of his officers sitting in the snow beside the sledge he'd been pulling. The man's name was Lieutenant John Irving, the one who wore the brass button that would eventually end up in a museum. Irving looked up at Crozier with eyes that held no hope, just exhaustion so profound it seemed molecular. "Sir," Irving said, "I don't think I can stand." Crozier knelt beside him, put a hand on his shoulder, felt the bone through fabric, through skin, barely any flesh remaining between them. He wanted to lie, to say it would be fine, that rescue was close. But you don't lie to dying men, not good ones. "I know," Crozier said. "Will you leave me?" "Yes." Irving nodded. Started unbuttoning his jacket with fingers that trembled. He removed the brass button, his good luck piece, the one from his father's naval service, and pressed it into Crozier's hand. "So someone knows I was here," Irving said. Crozier took the button. It felt cold. Everything felt cold. "I'll carry it," he promised. He stood, ordered the march to continue, left Irving sitting in the snow, watching them walk away. That night, from a distance, they heard a single gunshot. Crozier didn't send anyone back. There was no point. He sat in his tent, holding the brass button, wondering how many more he'd collect before the end. The march continued. Days became indistinguishable. Men died in their sleep, in their tents, while walking. Some simply stopped moving mid-step, as if they'd forgotten how. Others developed gangrene from frostbite and begged for amputation that Crozier couldn't provide because they had no surgeon left. The doctor had died weeks earlier, raving about silver fish swimming through the air. Scurvy ravaged them, teeth fell out, old wounds reopened, bones became visible through skin that wouldn't heal. And through it all, the hunger, constant, gnawing, all-consuming hunger that made men dream of food with hallucinogenic intensity. Crozier would wake to hear sailors describing feasts in vivid detail. Roast beef, potatoes with butter, bread so fresh steam rose from it. They spoke as if they were eating these meals, right there in tents where the only food was hardtack that tasted like metal in their own saliva. Inuit hunters watched from a distance. Crozier saw them sometimes, figures on ridgelines, observing but never approaching. He understood why. To the Inuit, they must have looked like corpses already, walking dead men pulling sledges full of meaningless British debris through a landscape that wanted them erased. He tried to make contact once. Walked toward a group of hunters, hands raised in peace. They backed away. One of them made a sign Crozier didn't understand, warding off evil, maybe, or simply acknowledging what Crozier was, a dead man walking. Crozier doesn't appear in the final records. No one knows exactly when or where he died. His body has never been definitively identified among the scattered remains found on King William Island. What we do know is this. At some point during that march, Francis Crozier faced the question every commander dreads. The food was gone, truly gone. The sledges had been abandoned miles back. The lifeboats were left behind. The men could barely walk, and they were still nowhere near salvation, just spread across a frozen wasteland in groups of 3 or 4, too weak to continue, too stubborn to lie down. Someone made the first cut. Historical evidence suggests it happened near a place now called Starvation Cove. Someone took a knife to a corpse, maybe someone who died naturally, maybe not, and made the decision that meat is meat, that survival trumps morality, that civilization is just a word you use when you're not hungry enough. Did Crozier give that order? Did he make it himself? Or did he simply allow it to happen, which is its own kind of decision? The bones don't tell us. They only confirm that it occurred. Systematic dismemberment, careful butchering, bodies processed with almost surgical precision, probably by men with medical training who understood anatomy. The brass button in Crozier's pocket would have felt heavier each day, each step, each choice. Lieutenant Irving had given it to him as proof of existence. Proof that a man named John Irving had been real, had mattered, had died with dignity. What would Irving think if he knew his body might have fed his shipmates? What would any of them think? Crozier carried the burden of knowing. That's what command means. You know, you see, you make choices that haunt you more than any ghost could, and then you walk forward because standing still is death, and death is, well, death is what they all were anyway, just on different timelines. Francis Crozier's remains have never been conclusively found. There are theories that he died near the southern coast of King William Island, that Inuit communities might have encountered him in his final days, that he possibly survived longer than most and tried to walk back north toward the ships. But nothing definite, no grave, no identified bones, no final message, just absence. In some ways, it's fitting. Crozier spent his entire career being overlooked. Talented but Irish, competent but not quite English enough, always the second choice. Now he's disappeared from history's record even in death, eclipsed by Franklin, whose name adorns the expedition despite dying first, but that brass button survived. It sits in Greenwich Museum, catalogued and preserved, carrying a temperature that shouldn't be possible behind climate-controlled glass. Museum staff have measured it, 43 degrees Fahrenheit, consistently, regardless of ambient temperature, as if it still remembers Arctic cold, as if it still holds some fragment of the men who touched it. Visitors press close to the case to read the placard explaining its significance. Most move on quickly. It's just a button, after all, just corroded brass. But occasionally someone will stop. We'll stand there longer than necessary. We'll notice that cold somehow radiating through glass and air and time. And they'll wonder about the man who carried it, about the promise he made to Lieutenant Irving, about whether he kept that promise or whether the promise died with him somewhere on the ice, frozen into permafrost that might never release its secrets. Captain Francis Crozier walked into the Arctic expecting to chart a passage. Instead, he charted the limits of human endurance, the collapse of civilization under pressure, the terrible mathematics of survival. He led 105 men into nowhere and brought back none of them, not even himself. But on quiet nights in museums, when security guards walk past the Franklin exhibition, some report hearing things. A voice with an Irish accent, very faint, barely there, giving orders, counting supplies, making calculations that no longer matter to anyone but the dead. The brass button knows it was there for all of it. Every choice, every failure, every moment when Crozier had to decide between competing horrors and chose the one that might buy his men another day, another hour, another breath. Buttons don't judge, they just witness and remain cold. When command means choosing which men die first, do you forgive yourself, or do you just stop counting?